Sheila Carr-Stewart has been researching and writing about educational issues and specifically a treaty right to education. That is an intriguing topic and I want to talk to her about it. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, I've been going to take the circuitous route to my first question. I've been reading George Will's great big book, The Conservative Sensibility. And in it, not sure how much Americanism is relevant in this case, but he talks about where do rights come from? Are they natural rights? Do we all possess them? Or are they bestowed upon us by the government? Or are they protected by the government? And that leads me to the title of your article, A Treaty Right to Education. Now, is this different than the right that all students have or the obligation they have to go to school? Otherwise, a truant officer will come and get them. What is a treaty right to education?
Well, I'm guessing what you're referring to, but I would say initially you're referring to all students who do not live on the reserve and are not Aboriginal, because we're looking at two different rights to education. Because First Nations people whose ancestors signed treaty, established treaty relationships with the Crown and the individual nations. And through those treaties, we get the right to education. So we have the right to education through the treaties. We also, the Constitution in Canada separates education for First Nations children separate from what it recognizes for students who live off the reserve and attend provincial school systems. The right for the province is to have education, but that only counts for those children that do not live on the reserve. If you live on the reserve, you have to look at the federal responsibility.
Now, your main field is education. Do I assume you are not a lawyer?
No, I'm not a lawyer.
Well, that's great because you make a lot of reference to treaties, constitution, and even case law, and we may be able to thus have a coherent and clear conversation since you're not a lawyer. Let's start with the constitutional right to an education for Indigenous people. That's a slightly different issue or a two-step issue, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the Constitution recognizes the federal government's responsibility for Indigenous people. And under that, that is where the federal government administers education through the Constitution. Also measures it through the Indian Act also, but the Constitution is the first one that separates First Nations people from other Canadians when we're looking at education.
Would it be accurate to call that kind of a double guarantee? There's the treaty guarantee, and then that was constitutionalized, or at least referenced in the Constitution, kind of bolstering the guarantee, doesn't it?
Well, I guess it would in the fact that, yes, it's in the Constitution. That's certainly a guarantee. That doesn't mean the government supports education by any great means. But yes, the Constitution actually does separate it. So yes.
I wonder if I could concede, or we could concede right off the bat, that there is double dealing, duplicity, and sharp dealing, etc. when it comes to the government. There is also no one law. People like talking about the rule of law, but there are multiple laws. So you document that there is this preposterous guarantee in some treaties that there will be education when what was called in those days and is still called in the Act when Indians want it, but in later treaties only when the government deemed it appropriate or when the Indians were ready for it. And then there was the doubly preposterous notion that the education was guaranteed, but no schoolhouse in which to have an education. Walk us through some of that duplicity, if you will.
When we look at the numbered treaties, particularly because the numbered treaties all refer to education. So when First Nations people and the Crown representatives discussed education, if you look at well, the easiest one is you look at textbooks written, you look at letters that people wrote at the treaties. They all mention that education would be provided for First Nations people on the reserve whenever they wanted it. And it's in all of the treaties. The words differ slightly in treaties, but they all set the policy for providing education through the treaties. Now, particularly when we're looking at Treaty 1 to Treaty 7, the Indian Act, actually it's 1 year into, already being in place 1 year when we get Treaty 7. But for the previous ones, there's no Indian Act. And they were negotiating with the federal government to get educational services. So the treaties look at that commitment that was taken between First Nations people and the treaty commissions. And that's where First Nations people believe that's where they get the right from educations, from the treaties. That's what they negotiated when they sat down to negotiate treaties with the Crown.
Now today, after the Constitution, the new Constitution, is there a treaty right to education for Indigenous groups who don't have a treaty or who have a treaty that doesn't mention education?
Well, I would argue, I'm looking into that now. I would argue that throughout history, so we're looking at the Mi'kmaq people, if you go back to them, there's all kinds of letters and agreements with them. You also get treaties in Ontario, and they begin to talk about, in Ontario, you can find letters referring to education when we're looking particularly at the Mississauga treaties. So if you look from first the Army and then the British government and ultimately Canada, there was always that commitment that they were going to provide education for First Nations people.
Now, you use an interesting legal phrase in your article, and it is sui generis, meaning, if I've got this right, that the rights of Indigenous people are unique and special and cannot be bent out of shape by trying to translate them into English or French or what the English or French culture or European culture thought they might be. It's what the Indigenous people themselves thought at the time of signing of those treaties they thought were those rights. Have I got that about right?
Yeah, that's about right.
And so if it was care and attention and looking after the Indigenous people, that includes education for any thinking person, one assumes, right?
One would assume.
Okay, so with the federal government neglecting its responsibility, treaty responsibility, walk us through that's essentially how we got residential schools, isn't it?
Well, residential schools has nothing to do with their treaties. Residential school happens to be what the federal government thought was best for First Nations people. So residential schools has nothing to do with, I would argue, with the treaties. Because residential school is simply a way that the federal government thought it was much better to educate First Nations people in residential schools. So one, they wouldn't learn their language, and two, they wouldn't learn their culture by going home to their parents, either if they were going to day school or if they were going, they would have no connection with their parents. So you eliminate language and culture from those children and their home base.
The way I read your article is that had the federal government been fulfilling its obligation to education, it wouldn't have allowed the religious groups to evolve into organizations which were providing education and then fund them. And that's how we got the residential schools. Now, that's a what if position in history, but the federal government absenting itself from its obligation really could be seen as the seat of a horrible future history.
When we look at residential schools, they already existed in the United States, and Canada chose to send an individual down there to look at residential schools. And he came back and he wrote his report. So we get residential schools in part because they already existed in the United States. And that's quite common in Canadian history. You look, particularly when you're looking at Indigenous history and other aspects of Canada, we look and see what's happening in the United States. So Canada chose to look at what the United States was doing, and then wrote up its own documentation and instituted residential schools. If Canada had continued to look at schools and not gone to the States, maybe we wouldn't have had residential schools. But they did, and they wanted to copy what the Americans were doing, and that's how we get residential schools.
Now, just before we get into where you think we are now or where we should be going, just a further reference or two to your article. Or you write in it that the Indigenous people were deprived of hunting and snaring and other cultural and economic activities, and that a right to education, a treaty right to education, could compensate for that by allowing them to enter the economy and make a different type of a living. Do you see that as kind of a contractual obligation, that because of the reduction or elimination of hunting and snaring and other traditional activities, you get education so you can do something else? Is that a sort of a quid pro quo?
I'm not quite sure where you're going. What are you actually getting at then?
Well, at the time of the Indian Act and the treaty commitment to education, Indigenous people were being moved off their land and deprived of their ability to hunt and snare, as you reference in your article. And do you see the right to an education to participate in the economy as in some way compensation for that?
In fairness to the treaty commissioners, I think in fairness, they wanted education. And I think when you look at the words, they wanted education to be provided for First Nations. And if you look at the treaty commissioners, many of them later on are always reminding the federal government that you have to provide education for treaty people. So you might want to be upset at treaty commissioners, but when you look at them overall, they write to the federal government, they argue that we need to provide education for First Nations people. So the federal government really ignores that, and I would argue just leaves education for First Nations people in the background and doesn't really bother with it. Then it sees what the United States does, introduces residential school because they see it by moving, the federal government sees it by moving the children away from the parents. They're going to make those children white, and they're going to become a part of the community.
Which is not exactly the intent of providing a right to education, of course.
Yeah.
Where are we now? You know, to read your article, there should be a school on reserves. There should be a full curriculum. The federal government should be paying teachers, it seems to me, as I read your article. But where are we in reality, in your view?
Well, I think we've come a long way. And I think there's some really good evidence of First Nations really deciding that they're going to do something about education. If you look at the Mi'kmaq, they've done extremely well with education. They've opted out of the Indian Act. So the Indian Act for education doesn't apply to Mi'kmaq people. They've set up an education system. Those children do as well as or better than Nova Scotian children on the test. So they've done extremely well. We've got some other nations going in that way. We have a group out here in Alberta that has just started on that. They're in their second year of creating a multi-year agreement. They didn't opt out of the Indian Act like the Mi'kmaq did, but they've created this school board, and they're doing extremely well in starting to look at it different. We have other people looking at that. But when we look at this, we're only talking, 3 or 4 nations across this whole country. So those people are doing really well. But I think for many First Nations across this country, we're doing better. We have more students graduating from university, but we still need to do a lot of work to improve education. As a parent, I have looked at schools and I would not have sent my students to some of the schools that the federal government was providing.
When you say those hopeful words and the increased numbers of people, Indigenous people graduating from university, I'm reminded of the statistics, forget what year, but your article talks about how there were a few hundred people, Indigenous students in grades 5 and 7, and down to double digits in 9 or none in 10 or some such numbers like that. I mean, it was really depressing. And I think the 1940s, is that where those statistics came from?
Yeah, you can get those probably, those kind of numbers, I would argue, are still around probably until the 50s and the 60s, and even maybe in the 70s too.
So
I mean,
it's a pretty shameful history, but huge improvement in the last few decades.
that's true for
Yeah,
some First Nations, absolutely.
yeah. Well, I appreciate your time and I appreciate your research. Thank you for speaking about it. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that we have to remember that when, for First Nations people, uh, they're looking for the commitment the Crown made to them when they entered those treaties, and particularly out West. That is a huge issue. We've argued it in courts in other cases. Um, so I think the federal government uh, needs to uh, put commitment and authority into education for First Nations people. They really don't have any professional educators in their system anymore. And yes, we have great systems like the Mi'kmaq have, but we're only talking a few groups like that.
Well, you've left on an important note the honor of the Crown, and the deal, the treaty, was with the Crown, not the government of the day in Ottawa. So thanks very much for emphasizing that, and we'll look forward to your next article.
Thank you. Bye bye.